I'm writing this because I'm no longer sure which parts of my reality belong to me and which parts are creeping in from somewhere else. I've spent the past 3 weeks trying to hold on to a sense of normalcy, but that slipped away the moment I found that dusty manila folder in our agency's off-site records bunker. Even as I type these words, I keep looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see something that shouldn't be there, lurking in the corner. My eyes are playing tricks on me constantly. I know I'm being watched, though whether it's by human eyes or something else I can't say. I can only hope that by sharing this, I might rid myself of what I've unwittingly invited into my life. I'm a temp, was a temp anyway, at a federal archiving facility. It's one of those unremarkable government contracting gigs most people pass over in job listings, but I took it because it meant steady work. The facility itself is a squat, concrete labyrinth outside city limits, the kind of building everyone forgets about the moment they drive by. Its corridors are lit by buzzing fluorescent tubes that cast a sickly, washed-out glow over everything. It should have been dull work, scanning decades-old memos, sorting them into digital folders, and occasionally uploading them to secure servers. Only it never felt that mundane to me. Perhaps I was the only one who found the hush of those endless corridors oddly mesmerizing, each row of file boxes like a piece in some grand puzzle. I guess I've always been a bit too curious. Most of the files I handled were routine, old case studies, legislative proceedings, budgets, and expense reports, stuff that had to be officially catalogued but would likely never be looked at again. Then, about 3 weeks ago, I was assigned to clear out a smaller side room tucked behind a set of squeaky double doors, an overflow area meant for records that had been misplaced or incorrectly labeled. My supervisor gave me a single directive: shred anything you don't recognize as standard federal documentation. Simple enough. But I couldn't ignore the feeling that something about those boxes called to me. I spent hours rummaging through them, pay stubs from decades ago, expired clearance badges, memos about office cafeteria updates, truly unremarkable clutter. Until I slid one battered box off the shelf and noticed a thin, folded document slip out from a gap in the bottom. It hit the concrete floor with a slap that seemed to echo too loudly, as if amplified by the hush of the entire building. I should have shoved it back and moved on, but I picked it up. And that's when I saw the classification stamp. Restricted. Eyes only. The file itself was a single folder, the label so faded I could barely read it. I made out what looked like Project Resonance, typed in an old courier-style font. At first, I thought it might be some leftover from the Cold War era or a defunct research project. But something about the name tugged at me. I cracked open the folder and found a handful of dog-eared pages. The top sheet featured a letterhead I didn't recognize, some government seal with minimal text. Sparse lines, like memos, talked about pattern recognition studies and visual anomalies in test subjects. There were references to strategic analysis, but certain lines had been heavily redacted with black bars. A single mention of an acronym, SADI, caught my eye, but I couldn't find any immediate explanation for what it stood for. That single folder felt heavier than it should have, like it carried an unseen weight. I heard my own pulse in my ears as I flipped through the pages. Random snippets stood out. Exceedingly high meltdown rate, abrupt shifts in perception, anomalies not following standard parameters. The language was so vague and clinical, but the descriptions of the phenomena, a word repeated multiple times, left me unsettled. I got the sense that the authors were dancing around something they couldn't fully describe. Since I was told to shred anything that didn't fit into standard records, I probably should have fed those pages straight into the hungry blades. But I didn't. I stuffed them into my messenger bag at the end of the day. I rationalized that curiosity got the better of me and that maybe I'd bring it up to my supervisor if it seemed important. But I knew deep down I wasn't going to hand it over right away. Something about the half-finished sentences, the redactions, and the hush-hush tone of it all made me feel that I'd stumbled onto a secret nobody else was supposed to see. That night, in my cramped studio apartment, I read the papers again. I spread them out on my small dining table under the meager light of a single lamp. My shadow fell across the text, and I had to keep shifting to read the lines. The more I read, the more questions surfaced. The words test subject appeared frequently, along with references to visual pattern interference and persistent anomalies. There was a mention of the term ADLs circled in pen as though an afterthought, but the full form of that acronym wasn't spelled out. Then there was something scrawled in the margins: SADI classification uncertain. Further observation required. I came across a short typed excerpt that looked like part of an interview transcript. Subject number 7.
They keep changing whenever I look directly at them. My head hurts so bad when I try to explain. It's like seeing something that's not supposed to exist at all.
Interviewer.
Take a deep breath. Tell me about these shapes. Are they uniform? Geometric?
Subject number 7.
No, not really shapes. They're like patterns in the walls or in the ceiling tiles. But they move when I look away, like eyes, but worse.
Even though I had no context, reading that made my stomach flutter with unease. Why was the subject speaking about moving patterns? What did that mean? My immediate assumption was that it must have been a psychological experiment studying illusions or hallucinations. But the lines, something that's not supposed to exist, and like eyes but worse, burned into my mind. I sat at my table for a long time, flipping those pages back and forth, trying to glean some cohesive narrative, but it all felt maddeningly incomplete. The next day at work, I found myself counting the hours until everyone left. I'd made up my mind to search that side room again to see if there were any more pieces of Project Resonance scattered around. For the entire morning, I scanned routine personnel files, but my thoughts were elsewhere. A persistent sense of dread had settled over me, but I couldn't decide if it was genuine fear or anticipation. By the time the office had mostly cleared out, people do have families and lives to get back to, I slipped away from my cubicle and returned to the musty side room. The building's hum grew louder without the chatter of co-workers. Every footstep echoed. When I flipped the overhead switch, the fluorescent tubes flickered erratically, painting the stacked boxes in jittery shadows. The air smelled stale like old paper, tinged with something metallic. I rummaged among the boxes, careful to glance at every label. Eventually, I found one that had the same cryptic letterhead as the folder. My heart pounded as I opened it. Inside were scattered documents, many of them too damaged by water or mold to read. But there were a few that had survived. Yellowed forms, blacked out lines of text, references to a strategic analog defense initiative. That time, the acronym SADI was spelled out fully, though it offered no real clarity as to what they did. The phrase analog distortion appeared a few times. Another partial transcript flitted to the floor when I picked up the stack, and I read it under the sickly overhead lights. Interviewer.
You mentioned you could feel it in your ears as well?
Subject number 9.
Yes, it's not just what I see. It's like static in my head. Everything else is quiet, but there's this. It's the pattern, I think.
Interviewer.
Has it changed since our last session?
Subject number 9.
Yes, Now it's there even when my eyes are closed. I can't escape it.
Something in the participants' anguish made my skin prickle. The mention of a hum reminded me of that weird feeling you get in a silent room when your ears ring with faint, phantom noises. I realized, with a jolt, that the overhead lighting in the corridor had a constant buzz, so subtle I'd tuned it out for months. Now I couldn't stop hearing it, and in that moment it felt oppressive, like it was pressing down on me. The next pages were official forms titled Study Observations. Terms like perception thresholds, distortion triggers, and cognitive dissonance events were scrawled in the margins. Each page repeated a phrase. Subjects reported a heightened sense of being watched. Another line, instances of pattern-located anomalies correlate with increased subject isolation. I didn't know what to make of it. Why were they isolating people who claimed to see living patterns? A chill crawled up my spine as if the walls themselves were listening. I half expected someone to barge in any second, demanding to know why I was reading restricted files. But nobody came. I was alone. And in that isolation, I remembered the corridor outside seemed so dim, as though the lights had grown weaker in the last few minutes. I kept searching through the box, rummaging deeper, my breath echoing in the silence. Eventually, I pulled out something that looked like a condensed briefing note, a bullet point summary perhaps. One segment jumped out at me.
Project Resonance, Phase 3. Testing subject susceptibility to patterns not grounded in conventional geometry. Investigating potential external influences. Observing if advanced pattern recognition predisposes certain individuals to encounter ADLs. Implementing fail-safes for containment and subject monitoring.
ADLs, that same acronym again with no further explanation. Advanced pattern recognition predisposes certain individuals. The words slid around in my mind, heavy with implication. Were they testing people's ability to see something most of us can't? And if so, what was the real purpose? I wanted more time to sift through everything, but the oppressive feeling in that cramped side room was growing too strong. My eyes started to play tricks on me. I thought the corners of the boxes were warping slightly, curving in ways that defied logic. My rational brain told me it was the flickering lights messing with my vision, but I couldn't shake the sense of being watched. So I gathered up whatever looked relevant, stuffed it into my backpack, and left for the night. I tried to appear casual when walking down the corridor, even though my hands were clammy with sweat. Every shape in the corner of my vision felt wrong. By the time I reached my car, my nerves were shot, and I pulled out of the parking lot as if something was chasing me. That night, I pored over the new documents in my apartment. The more I read, the more bizarre it became. One memorandum referenced possible infiltration of ADLs beyond the controlled testing environment. Another used cryptic language like distortions recognized in negative space. I found another interview snippet. Interviewer:
Can you describe exactly what you saw in the test pattern?
Subject number 12.
It was there and not there. The lines bent when I looked, and if I tried to trace them, it was impossible. It felt like the pattern was looking back at me. My head started pounding.
Interviewer:
And how did you react?
Subject number 12.
I screamed. I wanted it out of my head. I still do.
Reading that made my temples throb in sympathy. I became painfully aware of the old plaster on my apartment walls, the little hairline cracks that formed subtle shapes if I let my eyes drift. I normally never paid attention to them, but that night I couldn't stop. Every subtle line seemed suspicious, like it might rearrange itself the moment I blinked. By day 3 of my private investigation, paranoia had planted itself deep in my mind. I kept checking over my shoulder at work, certain that security or management would tap me on the shoulder with accusations of theft or unauthorized activity. But each day was routine. People typed away at their desks, drank stale coffee, and engaged in small talk about weekend plans. Nobody seemed to notice that I was constantly on edge. Yet, I could feel an almost tangible tension building, like a static charge in the air. It was present in the half-lit hallways, in the quiet hush of the bathrooms, in the silent stares of the security cameras. I started skipping lunch breaks just to rummage further in that musty storage room. Once, I spotted a co-worker glancing in my direction as I slipped through the squeaky doors. I tried to appear calm, but there was a look in his eyes. Confusion, maybe suspicion. One evening, when I was alone in the records room, the overhead lights flickered into darkness without warning. I was left in pitch black. My phone's glow was the only source of light, and I scrambled to turn on its flashlight. For maybe a full minute, I heard a faint, buzzing hum that seemed to swell around me. My pulse hammered. When the fluorescent lights blinked back on, I felt dizzy and disoriented. I'm sure it was just a power fluctuation, but in that moment I could have sworn I wasn't alone in the room. That was the night I discovered a battered VHS tape jammed in the bottom drawer of a rusted filing cabinet. No label on the tape, just a piece of peeling Scotch tape with Phase 2 scrawled on it. It seemed like an odd relic, but given the references to analog I kept seeing, I took it. I had to know if it held any clues. I found an old combo TV/VCR in the building's abandoned lounge, one of those relics from the early 2000s that nobody bothered throwing out. My hands trembled a bit as I fed the VHS into the slot. I half expected static or some test pattern, but what I got was far creepier. The video opened with a test chamber, white walls and harsh overhead lighting. A table stood in the center with what looked like an ancient tube television. The camera was stationary, presumably mounted in a corner. There was no audio track, just that unsettling hum of blank tape hiss. A man in a hospital gown sat in a metal folding chair staring at the TV screen. For about a minute, nothing happened. Then flickers of black and white patterns appeared on the TV in the footage, like rapidly cycling geometric shapes. The man's posture grew tense. He started leaning forward, his shoulders trembling, his hands clutched the sides of the chair. Eventually he pressed his palms against his temples. His mouth opened in a silent scream. No audio, but the anguish in his face was undeniable. He stayed like that for a while, trembling violently before the patterns on the TV ceased. Then the tape was cut abruptly to a new angle. The man was no longer there. Instead, there was a close-up of a flickering test pattern. Not the standard color bars, but something more chaotic. Lines swirling in a fractal design, bending in ways that made my eyes hurt if I tried to follow them. My heart pounded in time with the flicker. Then, as quickly as it appeared, it cut to static. The tape ended. I stood in that old lounge for a moment, stunned. My reflection in the dark TV screen looked pale, eyes wide. I realized my nails had dug so hard into my palms that they'd left little crescents. There was no explanation on the tape, no logos, no disclaimers, nothing. Just that horrifying glimpse of a man in agony over something only he could see, and then those maddening patterns. My head ached. I turned the combo set off and hurried back to my desk, my mind whirling with questions. That evening, I couldn't bring myself to go straight home. I drove around the deserted streets, passing under flickering street lamps. My eyes kept wandering to random shapes in the world. Storefront reflections, crosswalk lines, the geometry of shadows cast on the asphalt. Everything seemed to have a secret dimension, as if the lines might slip out of place at any moment. When I finally got home, I locked my door and shoved a chair against it. I collapsed onto my bed but found no rest. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that fractal pattern from the VHS warping behind my eyelids. A day later, a short email arrived in my work inbox. No official heading, no sender name, just a random string of letters as the address. The subject read, "Stop." The body of the email was blank except for a single link, which I dared not click. My heart hammered as I stared at the word, "Stop," an odd combination of threat and warning. It could have been spam, but something told me it wasn't. The primal fear twisting in my gut insisted that whoever sent it knew exactly what I was digging into, and they wanted me to quit. But fear and curiosity are strange bedfellows, and I couldn't let it go. If anything, the warning made me more determined. Later that evening, after everyone had gone home, I decided to break into the final row of the archives, where we kept especially old or mislabeled tapes, microfilm and audio reels. It was a restricted area, but I'd overheard the security code while delivering coffee to one of the senior staff a month ago. The corridor leading there felt longer than I remembered, like the walls had stretched overnight. My footsteps echoed as if I were walking through an underground cavern. I kept glancing at the flickering fluorescent lights. The hum had turned into a low drone that made the hair on my arms stand on end. The keypad beeped as I entered the code, and the heavy door clicked open. My hands shook with adrenaline, or maybe it was fear. Inside, the storage area was cramped and cluttered with dated technology. Shelves stacked high with cassettes, Betamax tapes, and old film canisters, nearly everything layered in dust. The air smelled stale, tinged with the faint odor of mildew. I moved my flashlight beam along the spines of unlabeled tapes, searching for anything that hinted at Project Resonance, or SADI. Many tapes had simple numeric labels, or none at all. Just as I was about to give up, my flashlight picked out a small binder on a top shelf. I dragged a stool over, climbed up, and retrieved it. The binder's cover read, Phase 1 to 3 Summaries, Restricted. Inside were logs typed in that same courier font, presumably from the early stages of Project Resonance. I carefully turned the pages, scanning short paragraphs that described an initial discovery of bizarre anomalies in analog data streams. Over time, the notes said, the anomalies seemed to correspond to patterns that only certain test subjects could see. I started noticing references to analog distortion lifeforms, ADLs, like ephemeral organisms that lived in the negative space of patterns. The binder was careful not to define them outright, but implied they weren't mere illusions. Something about them was real enough to require containment. I felt a dreadful chill, like reading a cryptozoology text that turned out to be true. The logs explained exposure protocols. These patterns had to be presented to subjects in controlled ways, presumably to see who recognized them. It described multiple test phases culminating in Phase 3, a secret trial that used advanced pattern sequences to measure how deeply subjects could perceive the intangible forms. The creepiest part was a footnote that said, high-risk subjects show potential for uncontrolled manifestation events. Even that vague statement made my mouth go dry. Was the mere act of seeing these shapes enough to draw these entities out of wherever they resided? I thought of the flickering VHS patterns, the lines that seemed to push into my mind like a migraine. A terrifying notion crystallized. Maybe those illusions became real once perceived. I leafed through the last few pages, but they had been torn out. Some leftover scraps suggested that SADI had a broader mission, to identify, track, and contain these so-called ADLs. But to what end? Were they capturing them or just trying to keep them under wraps so the public wouldn't panic? My heart thumped. What if I'd already let them in just by reading all these files? After an hour, I replaced the binder exactly as I found it, not wanting to arouse suspicion. Back in my car, I stared at my reflection in the rearview mirror under the flickering dome light. My eyes looked sunken. I looked like someone who'd gone too far into something best left unknown. Still, I resolved to keep searching, to get to the bottom of Project Resonance before it unraveled my sanity completely. That weekend, I took all the copies I'd made, both digital scans stored on a thumb drive and physical documents, to a secluded corner of the county library. I needed a place away from my apartment and from the office, a place that felt neutral. I spread them out on a wooden table beneath the library's fluorescent lights. My plan was to organize them chronologically and see if I could piece together a timeline. But even in that quiet, open space with other people around, I felt a shiver. Every time someone walked past or coughed or dropped a book, my nerves spiked. As I sorted the documents, more bizarre references jumped out. People complaining of shifting lines on the edge of their vision, a staff memo urging extreme discretion. Incidents at the site must not be documented in standard reports. Participants testified that they felt lifted from normal reality when they looked too closely at certain patterns. It was maddeningly disconnected, yet I sensed a single thread of truth weaving through it all. Something about how the human brain is wired to seek patterns, even in chaos, and how these experiments deliberately triggered that search in ways that let subjects see other things. Halfway through that research session, I felt a presence behind me, and I nearly jumped. It was just an old man scanning the shelves for a newspaper, giving me an odd look. I tried to calm my racing heart. My sense of paranoia was definitely out of control, but maybe for good reason. The deeper I went, the more convinced I became that the document's mere existence posed a threat. On Monday morning, a sealed envelope was waiting for me on my work desk. No return address, and my name was typed on the front. I hesitated before opening it. Inside was a single sheet of paper that read, "We know what you have. This is your final warning." Beneath that, in black marker, was a string of numbers that looked suspiciously like date and time. Thursday, 11:15 p.m. I broke into a cold sweat. The building locked down by 9 p.m. each night, so what did it mean? That day, I kept expecting some stern men in suits to arrive, badges in hand, instructing me to come with them. But no one did. Instead, the day crawled by in tense normalcy, with me quietly scanning more official documents, eyes flicking to the clock every other minute. I decided that if someone wanted to meet or intimidate me on Thursday night, I wouldn't give them the satisfaction. Yet a part of me, some insane kernel, felt drawn to see what would happen. This was like playing a game I didn't understand, with stakes that might be life-altering. Tuesday came and went, and with each passing hour, I felt the weight of those documents intensifying. My nights were plagued by nightmares in which the lines of my bedroom walls bent into swirling fractals, forming faces that watched me with blank, unblinking eyes. Sometimes I'd start awake, heart hammering, certain I heard that low hum from the facility's lights in my own apartment. Worst of all, I caught myself gazing at patterns in tile floors, in the texture of my blankets, in the arrangement of books on my shelf, and feeling them shift under my scrutiny. On Wednesday, I found another note taped to my locker in the break room. "You've been chosen for this. Stop fighting." That's when I realized I might not be an accidental interloper in these secrets. Maybe Project Resonance was designed so that someone like me, someone with a relentless appetite for the unknown, would get pulled into it. It was a deeply unsettling thought. By Thursday, I was a raw nerve. I'd stashed all the stolen documents off-site, locked in a rented storage unit. The day passed in a blur of busy work. At 9 p.m, security made their rounds, and I pretended to leave with the night shift, but I doubled back. I hid in a restroom stall until I heard the overhead announcements that the building was closing. Fear coiled in my gut. The building's hum felt more resonant than ever. At 10:45 p.m, I emerged, hugging the shadows as I navigated the deserted corridors. My footsteps made hollow echoes. At precisely 11:10, I found myself outside the door to the same small side storage room where I'd first uncovered the Project Resonance folder. My heart rattled in my chest. A single overhead bulb flickered, casting the corridor in a strobe of pale light and darkness. I inched the door open, half expecting to see a figure waiting inside, but it was empty. The dusty boxes loomed like silent sentinels. I stepped in, letting the door shut behind me. For 5 minutes I waited, hearing only the racing of my pulse. At 11:15 exactly, a phone rang, an old landline phone mounted on the wall, something I'd never noticed before. My throat went dry. Part of me wanted to bolt, but my trembling hand reached for the receiver. I lifted it, but I was not even sure what to expect. There was no greeting, only a distorted voice that crackled through the line.
Do you see them now?
It asked, words smeared by static. Before I could form a reply, the line clicked dead. Then all at once the overhead light began buzzing loudly. It flickered, intensifying as if surging with power. The boxes around me seemed to shift in my peripheral vision, their edges contorting subtly. The room felt claustrophobic, or maybe it was expanding, I couldn't tell. Dots of black swam in my vision, and my ears were assaulted by that relentless hum, now nearly deafening. Panic seized me. I stumbled backward and heard the scrape of boxes toppling. That's when I saw it, or felt it, a shape in the corner of the room, right where the fluorescent light stuttered. It wasn't a shadow. It was like a gap in reality, a place where lines didn't line up. My eyes rebelled, refusing to focus. And in that same instant, the shape in my peripheral vision moved. My skin erupted in goosebumps, and a bolt of primal terror shot through me. I don't remember scrambling out of that room, but somehow I ended up in the corridor, sprinting. The building felt wrong, each hallway longer than it should be, each corner twisting into darkness. The doors that I expected to see were missing and had been replaced with blank walls. That hum followed me, merging with the frantic pounding of my heartbeat. I caught glimpses of flickering shapes in the corners. If I looked directly, they vanished, but I could feel them pressing in. When I finally reached the main exit, the doors swung open under my shaking hands, and I spilled out into the cold night air, gulping it in. The security guard at the gate was absent, though I sensed eyes in every dark corner. I jumped into my car and peeled out of the lot, not caring if I triggered alarms. My eyes stung with tears, and I had to fight to keep the vehicle steady. Whatever I had just experienced was beyond rational explanation. It was as though Project Resonance had come alive around me. I slept in a motel that night, leaving my phone off. The nightmares were worse than ever, a swirl of impossible angles and flickering patterns chasing me through dream corridors. I woke in sweat-soaked sheets, mind reeling. I wanted to think it was all some vivid hallucination, stress-induced delirium. But the leftover feeling in my bones insisted otherwise. The next day, I learned that my access card had been deactivated. No surprise there. My supervisor left me a curt voicemail. "Your contract is terminated. Return any government property immediately." No mention of stolen documents, no mention of Project Resonance. They just wanted to be rid of me quietly. I spent that weekend holed up in my apartment, sifting through everything I'd discovered, trying to come to terms with the idea that maybe the documents themselves were a test. That Project Resonance was always about seeing who could perceive these anomalies. And once you see them, you can't unsee them. They see you too. I noticed changes in my environment. The walls sometimes bent at the edges of my vision. Random electronic devices, my microwave, my old alarm clock, crackled with static even when unplugged. I'd catch fleeting shapes in reflections, gone the moment I turned my head. No matter how hard I tried to ignore it, I felt I was part of an experiment that was never truly shut down, a subject unwittingly recruited. Now I'm typing this out in the hope that documenting it might grant me some form of release. Or maybe I'm still playing right into their hands. I don't know anymore. The truth is, I'm not sure how much time I have left before these entities, or whatever you want to call them, wear me down completely. I don't sleep much. My eyes burn. When I close them, the swirling lines remain. If there's anyone reading this, anyone at all, I'm sorry. Truly I am. Because if you've made it this far, you're probably scanning your own surroundings now. You might start noticing shapes in your wallpaper or in the static of your TV at night. Maybe you'll chalk it up to paranoia, maybe you'll brush it off. But there's a chance you'll see them, and once you do, they see you. I found classified government files about tests on human pattern recognition, tests that revealed glimpses of something that defied our notion of reality. I tried to warn you, but if your eyes trace the lines in the ceiling tonight and you notice them shift, I apologize in advance, because you've just proven you can see what SADI was looking for all along, and that means they found you too.